I'm pleased to say we're joined now by former Head of Religion and Ethics at the BBC, Aqill Ahmed. Aqill, great to have you with us. Good morning to you. I'm fascinated to hear your perspective on this as a former boss at the BBC. Do you think the BBC have handled this correctly, asking Gary Lineker to step aside for tonight's show?
Well, I'm speaking today in a purely personal capacity, not representing anybody I work for right now, but I would say I think they're in a difficult decision. They made a difficult decision. Whether it's the right thing or not, only they can tell. What you've seen there with that report from Jake is that obviously a lot of people disagree with what they've suggested, simply because many people would point to the hypocrisy of that particular decision, and also point to the fact that Gary is a sports presenter. His views are pretty well known anyway with regards to this and many other particular kind of subjects. He's not a news and current affairs presenter, and is he entitled to have an opinion as a freelance employee, not a full-time employee? Can the BBC really, or any employer, really police somebody who has a job which is actually only a part-time job? He's a freelancer. And so this opens up a whole load of issues, and I can understand the BBC wanting to get to the bottom of it. My question would only be, actually, did they really understand the makeup of how people operate these days? Gary is effectively has a portfolio career. He has a number of employers, and so can the BBC really impose its particular perspective on social media policy on somebody who is a freelancer, as opposed to somebody who's a full-time worker? So I actually think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered here. And I think what it does is show you that the nature of how we work has changed radically.
Yeah, Aqill, is the freelancer a bit of a red herring, though, in the sense that you know how it works in this business? You can be classed as a freelancer because a lot of presenters are employed on separate contracts, so it'll be on a freelance contract. That's all to do with tax and how you manage it, and whether he's employed as himself or whether he's employed as a broadcasting company. And it's all complex, but it's in effect he's one of the BBC's highest paid stars, if not the highest paid. Therefore, the fact whether he's got on a freelance contract or a staff contract is sort of neither here nor there.
No, I would agree with you generally, but I think on this one that's not the case, because he does work for other employers. He actually has, if you follow football globally, for that matter, you'll know Gary Lineker from other broadcasters that he works for. For many years he presented the Champions League coverage for BT Sport. He does work for other broadcasters, so I understand. I know exactly what you're on about. I actually was interviewed by HMRC when this first broke as a story a few years ago, so I understand that, having been an employer of people. But I think in this one, he really is a freelancer. Now, a lot of us are freelancers who work for many different organisations, and actually, what this does is throw up that interesting argument: has he broken? If he was a full-time member of staff at the BBC, I think there would be a completely different conversation. This is not me dismissing it and saying it's a storm in a teacup. This is me saying it's complicated because of the nature of his contract and the fact that he's not actually a news and current affairs presenter. When, if we worked in news and current affairs like all of us have here, the standards are very, very different than they are for somebody else. And I think we've lost sight of that, because we do have people associated with news and current affairs who do have strong views.
So, Aqill, do you think
they're allowed to have those strong views as well? So why a sports presenter is not allowed to have them, I think, is quite interesting.
Aqill, that's really interesting that you say that, because do you think a distinction does need to be made between what sort of presenting you do at the BBC? I wanted to get your reaction to the former Director General of the BBC, Greg Dyke. He's been speaking this morning. He says that what he thinks the BBC did with Gary Lineker in asking him to step aside off Match of the Day tonight, they said was a mistake. And he goes on to say that Gary Lineker is a much-loved football reporter and presenter, but if you start applying those rules to everybody who works for the BBC, where does it end? And he mentions Sir Alan Sugar and David Attenborough as well, who both make political comments, whether that's about a political party or about the environment. So do you think that's where the distinction needs to be made? Is that where the BBC needs to move with this? In terms of social media policy, perhaps there needs to be a distinction between whether you're a news presenter or something else.
Absolutely agree with that comment. I mean, you do have to have a distinction. I mean, I think it depends on what you say as well, doesn't it, really? Because the amount of that you can still bring the BBC into disrepute depending on what you say. Your views can be so abhorrent that actually it doesn't matter if you're a sports presenter. But I think on this thing, actually, you're having a political opinion where there is no. I think it's not. I think I agree completely with what Greg says. I also understand the argument. A lot of people are throwing around about So Lord Sugar has said some pretty full-on things, which you would argue would get you into a lot of trouble, and actually doesn't seem to have the same kind of traction that this has. So I do think that this has been politicised. I do think that the BBC management maybe, if they could have their time again, may think differently. But I do think this does go back to what Greg says, what I've been saying, what many other people have been saying, which is the world of work has changed. And it's difficult for an organisation like the BBC, which has had a standard way of operating for some time, and it is trying to be flexible. But I think it has to change radically. And we also have to change what we think about the BBC as well, because we think if you're the highest paid presenter, does that make you ultimately the face of the BBC? Some would argue yes. But actually, if it's not your only form of employment, then is it fair to actually hold you to the same kind of standards as somebody who is on a full-time contract at the BBC? And that's the thing that we need to nail down on. And actually, if that's what the BBC is going to sort out, then how long will Gary Lineker be off air for? Because that might take quite a while. And will Gary and all the other presenters and the commentators, will they be back next week?
Yeah.
I don't think he's not going to apologise, is he? So what's going to happen? This will have to be done very, very quickly. So they may have got themselves into a very difficult situation.
But it's interesting because you know how this works, Aqill, in terms of a wider organisation and the rank and file, if you like, and nothing creates problems within a newsroom and within an organisation if you've got someone who is paid an awful lot of money and as a result is a freelance contract and all the rest of it, who seems to be you're operating within an entirely different set of rules of those rank and file people. I mean, we're getting reports of some people at the BBC, staff members, being very unhappy with how Gary Lineker is treated, that he seems to be working on a different set of rules and principles. That has also got to be considered by the BBC, hasn't it?
It has, but then again, a lot of the rank and file, and I can put myself in that when I was there, were very unhappy with other individuals as well being allowed to get away with lots of things. So that's always going to be the case. I think you have to understand it depends on your definition of rank and file as well. If you are on a fixed term contract or if you're a freelancer, you may think very differently than if you're a full-time member of staff. And I know from my time there, and things may have changed a little bit, but news and radio in particular had huge amounts of members of staff who were on staff contracts, whereas in television, the vast majority of the staff are on fixed-term contracts or freelancers. So there's a very big difference even within the rank and file, as it were, of the BBC staff. But I do appreciate that, decisions that get made have huge impact on everybody who works for an organisation and for the way people interact with the organisation. And it's interesting, isn't it, that people in BBC Sport, the actual people the commentators, the presenters, the pundits, etc., they have actually said that they stand in solidarity with Gary. Not necessarily saying they agree with what he said, but they're standing in solidarity with how they feel he's been treated. And I think to be asked to stand down is actually just a fancy way for saying you've been suspended, isn't it, really? Because he hasn't agreed with the standing down of it. So he has been suspended over a tweet from an organisation that he doesn't work full-time for. It does start to say that actually, where do you stop? Where do you draw the line? Because in terms of free speech has to have certain limits depending on who you work for and what your position is. But if he tweets something on a Wednesday, and on a Wednesday he's not working for the BBC, I'm just saying this is the thing for the great minds to get their heads around. Does that bring the BBC into disrepute if he only works for the BBC on, say, Friday and Saturday?
Yeah.
Does the BBC able to police what he does on a Wednesday? This is the thing that has to be sorted out. Will it be sorted out by next weekend?
Well, no,
I don't know.
Not a chance. Aqill, do you know what? It's really fascinating to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Raises all these points I hadn't thought of.
No,
so that's really
interesting.
interesting.
I could have talked to Aqill all morning.
Yes, well, there you go.